Hi, and welcome to the second video on how I make my collage papers. This one's going to be all about mark making and making unique papers with organic marks on them. So what I'm talking about is super organic marks that you make yourself. So things like things that look like handwriting or just brush marks with different textures. And these are, again, just done on regular copy paper. These little things were a little cork, was a wine bottle cork that I just stamped on there. So it really can be done with anything you find around the house or, you know, anything that can make a mark. Sometimes they're more solid marks. Sometimes they're a little bit more organic. And I'm going to demonstrate a couple of the methods that I do, but certainly you can make marks any way you want. Now, for my mark making, I have a tendency to do these in India ink or acrylic ink and generally do them dark. Or I also do sometimes some white marks. So you'll see here on this piece of Deli paper, I actually did some marks in white, so that if I have some darker pieces on my collage that I want to add some marks over, I have some white that I can do that. But you'll see here there's like a variety of different marks that you can get. You can even just use a Sharpie and draw some lines. The important thing is with mark making is that you need to use something that's permanent. So one of the reasons why I like using India ink is that, like, once it dries, it's permanent and it's really, really dark. So it gives me a really, really rich black. If you look at stuff that I've done with like acrylic inks, you'll see it's a much more muted color. Here's one that I did on Deli paper, and I believe I did this on the Gelli plate. And what I did is I just rollered some of the, I put some ink on and then rollered it around and maybe even put a little spray on it. And you get these water textures that separate from some of the ink, and you get these interesting patterns. So this is almost a patterned one, but it's kind of a mark making because I do it in the darker color. For me, I use it that way. Again, this probably was ink on there that I used some sort of tool to make marks through. And then, of course, you know, you can always do some handwriting. So here's some of the tools I use. I created these little crazy mark making tools. This is just a stir stick. This one I just threw some garden string on, so it's a little bit stiff. This was some other sort of string that I had that I put on there, and I think I had one here. Like, I think this one is what I got using this, just dipping it in the ink and making marks that way. Obviously, you can use a palette knife. I have a bunch of these that have patterns on them. I see that one I need to clean off. Things like credit cards, you can use the edge to make lines, palette knives. Even my color shaper, you know, you can do things on. So what I thought I would do is just demonstrate a couple of ways that I do some of the marks that are more like this. And these are nice because, you know, you can just use pieces of them to add some really strong colors. Now, I have a couple of different things. So I use acrylic ink. This is an indigo. I also have black India ink. You certainly could use acrylic paint. It's a little bit harder because you have to water it down because you almost need a more liquidy texture for the mark making. The other thing I use, especially for creating the writing part of this, is these fine liner applicator bottles. And then what I do is I put liquid acrylic in here, the high flow acrylics. And I have one in black, a white, and I think I have a blue as well. The other thing that would work if you have acrylic inks, or you could use watercolor inks, you just have to know that with the watercolor inks, once you start putting gloss medium or matte medium over them to stick things down, sometimes that runs. So it's better to use acrylic inks. And, you know, that has a little dropper on it. So you can also use that to create marks as well. Okay, so first let's just use the fine liner. So again, this has a tiny little tip on it. I generally have a little paper towel handy here just to kind of get it started, to make sure it's not a blob. And then, you know, you can just do whatever writing you want. Keep it, scribbles, whatever. Now this is rice paper, so you'll see it's sort of soaking in a little bit. If you do this on something like a deli paper or white sort of bond paper, like this is the deli paper, you'll see that it doesn't soak in as much. And it should dry nice and crisp. So here with the deli paper, I'm getting a little bit more bleed through, and I think that's okay. So I'm just thinking, and again, it can be anything you want. They're really just marks to give a sense of, I don't know, writing or something else. Okay, so that's what the fine tip bottles, and you can get these in different size tips, so you can make your writing bigger or smaller depending on what you want. The most difficult thing I found about these things is getting the, you know, the little thing back in the tip to keep it clean. All right, so that's the fine liner bottle, and you'll see it's kind of bled through here. So you want to make sure that you set that aside to dry. Now I could grab a piece of paper and pick that up as well. And I can use this as my off sheet. The other option, oh, I guess I could leave this out. The other option is to actually draw on here. And again, you can do whatever you want. And this is just a plastic sheet protector. You could use a jelly plate, although I wouldn't use this tip on a jelly plate because it will scratch it. Or you could try something like wax paper or just anything that's plastic that the ink will sit on and not soak into. Now, when I do this on here, it's going to squish that ink down onto the plastic. So that's where I'm getting these thicker lines from. Because what it's doing, as you can see, it's spreading out the ink because it's not soaking into that plastic. So I can get some bigger marks with that. And then you just have to be a little careful pulling this off. All right, so this paper doesn't work so well on here. This is sort of a cheaper kind of brown art paper. But you'll see if you do wet this down, you can wipe it off. And if for some reason the water doesn't work, what I like to use is actually a baby wipe. And you see that, you know, if you scrub just a little bit, you know, put a little bit of work into it, it does come off fairly easily. And let's try the other side. So we're going to do the same thing. I'm just going to create a pattern on here. And before that dries, I'm going to get this is deli paper, and get it on there. So I think the trick here is to not let it sit on the plastic or really anything too long. You want to kind of get your paper on there fairly quickly. And you'll see with the deli paper and tissue paper and rice paper, it is going to soak into that paper a little bit. So let's see if this pulls off easier. Yeah, so the deli paper pulls off a little bit easier than the rice paper. So this is interesting. It kind of created a, when I pulled it off, it kind of created a sort of a little bubble pattern, which is really actually interesting. Here's my other paper that I used previously. I'm going to see if I can get a little bit more of that off. It's already dried. Okay, so let's give it a spray. See if we can reactivate it a little bit. I'm going to try some tissue paper. It's probably going to be a huge mess, but you know, until you try, you just don't know. So, can rip a sheet off. Let's put it on there. Now, I may have to just leave this sheet protector. I may have to leave it on here till it dries, because at this point in time, I'm probably not going to be able to pull this off without it ripping to shreds. So that also gives it the opportunity to kind of soak into the paper a little bit more and pull some of that off. So let me set that aside. Okay, so the other option is to use palette paper. And this is a sheet I used from the solids ones that I did. So you'll see I cleaned it off quite a bit. For regular mark making, I am going to just do that on white paper, and I'm just going to tear a sheet in half. So I have these little, you can use glass or whatever you have, basically. And I'm just going to put a little bit of ink in there. Now this is indigo, so it's a pretty blue color. I haven't actually, this is fairly new, so I actually haven't had a chance to do some mark making with that. So I'm going to just use this crazy little brush tool. Now I see I have to shake it up because the ink is really, really diluted. It's generally a really, really dark ink, although I kind of like the light too. But let me do this. Shake it up. And there we go. I can already see that's going to be different. So it's a much darker blue. So there's a lot of ways that you can create tools to do mark making. Just some old string that I had laying around. You could use something like a fan brush. You can even let it run if you want. You know, you can make marks like this. You could make stripe marks. Normally I wear gloves when I'm working with ink because it does stain your hands and it does take a few days to get off washing them. All right, so fan brush can give you some interesting marks. And I, try to use every inch of the paper. And again, you want to make sure you have a good place to set these all aside to dry. What else do I have? Okay, so I have this credit card here, although I don't think I'm going to be able to get this in here. But you can do, marks at the side of it. Still feels a little bit weak to me, like it should be darker. There we go. I think it was just, had to be shaken up. Right, so if you like lines, you could create some papers with, stripes and vertical marks, horizontal marks. You can scrape it, create marks. You can splatter it, obviously. So I just try to find things that I may not have maybe made marks with before and see what I can come up with. I also like to use the color shaper because you can make some nice, really nice even marks. Oops. If you want to make some patterns, you can also drag it over some of the marks that are there and get like softer marks. There's so many ways to make marks. It's really just exploring and finding out what kind of marks you like, and then finding things to make the marks with. I like to keep a lot of things around, like here is a round, I don't know, from something, a paint tube or something. Let's set that one aside. You know, I use circles and geometric marks in my stuff a lot. That one got extra, sort of suctioned up a bubble there, which is kind of interesting. So we'll leave that. See, now I couldn't create that even if I tried. So it's fun to come up with things that you couldn't actually even create. Same, because I'm pulling it off the bottom here, so it's sort of creating a bubble. Suctioning it on there. Here's a cork. Let's see what kind of mark that makes. These are more kind of blobs. There's just so many things that that you can try to make marks with. You can certainly use a paintbrush. Set that one aside. I'm going to grab another sheet of my Deli paper. Now, with inks, you want to be a little bit careful that you're not using super great brushes, because once ink dries, it does, it can ruin your brushes. So I wouldn't use a super expensive brush. Oh, here's another thing that I've used in the past. Things like feathers, branches, things I've found outside. There's so many ways to make marks. It's just really fun to play sometimes. Things like toothbrushes. You can, and again, here's why you want to have the gloves on. You can spray and make spatter. If you like that kind of thing. See, you're going to get really dirty. Even paper towels can create texture. So if I soak this up and stamp it on there, you know, I can create texture with that too. And all of this I consider mark making, even though, you know, you may think of it as patterned collage papers, because I'm making the marks myself personally. I'm not doing it through a stencil or some other sort of artificial way of doing it. So one of the other options for making marks, again, with the writing, is I bought these Sennelier 3D liners, and this is, again, just acrylic paint. So it's the same idea as the fine liner, except that this has got a bigger tip on it. So again, you could create marks on this any way you want. It's not as fluid, so the marks that you make aren't quite as, it's not quite as uniform And I bought the basic set, which is basically the 3 primary colors in white and black. And I do use these occasionally on my collages over them, like after I'm done with them, to add some marks. I haven't really used them for papers so much yet. The other option is, let's see, I have this blue up here, so let me see if I can sort of suck that up a little bit, is to use something like an acrylic ink. And again, you can just spread it out. And just suck up ink to make marks. Now, I probably should have done this on the other side here, since that's where I was doing all my other marks. And that creates interesting splotches and patterns. And you can do all of this stuff on the Gelli plate too. If you have a Gelli plate and you like to use that, yeah, all these same techniques will work on that. I just wanted to show you some ways to use things that you may already have in your studio without having to get a Gelli plate. So things like palette paper, wax paper, you could try parchment paper, plastic sheet protectors work. You know, anything where the paint won't soak in and dry super quick is all good. Okay, so here is all of our mark making papers that are now dry. I do think that the indigo ink should be darker, so I think it just needed to be mixed up, although I love this color. But you'll see there's a lot of different ways that you can use tools to make marks. And this one's quite interesting, so I'm going to see if I can use this in something. And of course, the asemic writing is always good for accents in collages. So have fun. Just find some things around your house, your studio, your office, wherever you are that you think might work for making marks, and just go for it. Okay, so we've had some fun doing some mark making. I didn't want to make this video a complete, like every way I make marks, because it would be 5 hours long. So what I did is I pulled some of the previous things that I've done, and I'm just going to talk through them a little bit, just for things or ideas for you. You can use old books, pages from books, to put marks on. You know, this is a combination of ink and acrylic paint. I believe this was a small Gelli plate, but it was doing multiple layers and doing marks with a brush or a palette knife and some layering. Again, using tools. This may have been one of those crazy brushes that I created with yarn or, you know, string. You could use tree branches and weeds and all sorts of things to make marks, just dipping them in ink. Here's some additional ones that I did as far as stamping circles and covers of things or round objects that you have. But you can get things with, like, you know, double things, and even, you know, this interesting pattern of layering these things over you could do, you know, use in a collage. These are just painted pages with, you know, I needed some darker greens and browns and then I came back over with my fine liner bottles to just do some sort of mark making on top of. So, you know, the first pass doesn't have to be the end. You can, you know, make some papers and then come back and just add, you know, add more layers. This one is, this is on a rice paper, so it's a little bit more thin. This was on a regular bond paper. And again, just made some marks with the brushes, you know, and a lot of times in the small collages, you're just pulling out a small section. So even though this looks kind of messy and amateurish, you know, you generally would only use small sections as accents. Let me come back to these. So, here's the other half of that. That one, I think I did a large page. Like I probably did this, yeah, really big and sort of cut it in half so it fits in my containers. This one I just did when I was like cleaning off my roller. with some previous ones. I had used this as a roll-off page, and it got some, I don't know, some wet blobs of paint on it at some point. But anyway, it turned out really, really interesting. I really like some of the things that are happening here. So again, there's so many ways to make marks and make papers. And then lastly, I just wanted to talk about these a little bit because I think these, one, are kind of fun. And two, they really make things that you couldn't actually paint. They're kind of random patterns. And the way I did this is I have these, I guess they're like deli trays. So what I did is I cut a sheet that fit in here, mostly, and got out my India ink. This may have actually been liquid acrylic, like the high flow acrylics, but you could use India ink as well. And I got a little container like this and put some in there. And then I had, I don't know, 6 or 7 marbles. And what I did is I put the marbles in here, got them all full of ink, dumped it in here, and then you just let them roll around the tray. And, you know, they make these random marks, and it's super fun to do. So I just wanted to show you those couple of other ways that I make marks, because going through that process on video would just take a long time. So just sort of talking through them, I think, will help hopefully give you some ideas as well.